This is David Robertson running for State House District 97 in the northern part of Jefferson County. Last video, I talked about the fact that we have a constitutional republic and not a democracy. There's a lot of misinformation and miseducation about the system of government we have, and it's important to understand the actual system of government. I also alluded to the fact that there's a philosophy that the founding fathers and a world viewpoint they had. And it's important to understand that philosophy because you really can't understand the Constitution unless you understand what was their world viewpoint out of which that Constitution flowed. And I will admit to you, I was fortunate enough to go to some good schools growing up. I was never told anything accurate about our system of government, and especially not about the philosophy of the founders. So this was something I learned about later in life. And frankly, so I was surprised when I learned out what their philosophical viewpoint of the world was. I'm by no means an expert on this, but I know the basics. And as I understand it, the founders, they viewed something called the natural state of the world. They said that's one system of how people relate to each other and not having really any government, just existing as familial units. But the thing about that is, if you think about, like, go back to Neanderthal times, and there's all these different families, and let's suppose a marauding tribe comes and attacks a number of families living in the same area, and they pillage their goods, and maybe they kill some people. Those families would very likely get together and say, hey, in our own mutual benefit and defense, we need to band together and form some kind of militia or some kind of protection unit to protect our goods and families. And so they would do that. That was like a very crude form of government, but that was a government where it was the consent of the governed. The founders viewed that as another system you can have where people come together and they say, in order to better preserve our inalienable rights, we need to form this government. And the other thing I'll say too, and I've mentioned this before, is they believe that God created the universe, and by virtue of that fact, we have certain inalienable rights as are enunciated in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and that the sole purpose of government is to protect and preserve those inalienable rights, that people can voluntarily come together and form their own government of the people where all the power resides with the people to better protect their inalienable rights. And so that little kind of silly example I used was that people came together to protect their inalienable right of life. They don't want to be attacked and killed anymore. They formed some kind of defensive structure to protect their families. And so that was the basic founders' view of the world. The other thing about their viewpoint is they had a view of the law of nature and nature's God. And so when they looked at inalienable rights, they said some of these inalienable rights are laws of nature. So, for example, if you go and attack mother bear in its den with its cub, what's going to happen? That mother bear will fight to defend. So they said even animals know that they have certain inalienable rights, and one of those is possession of private property, right? And so they look to nature to derive some of the inalienable rights that we have preserved in our Constitution, such as the right to defend yourself. There'll be the Second Amendment. They say, look, a squirrel knows it has a right to defend its house. Then how can a human being not have that right? But then they also looked at other animal behavior. So they said, one squirrel might murder another squirrel to get its nuts, okay? And they'd say, that's not really right, because that's depriving that squirrel of life. And so they also look to biblical ideas and concepts such as are found in the Ten Commandments. And they said other inalienable rights we have, such as the right not to be murdered by your fellow man so that person can take some of your stuff. That doesn't come from the animal kingdom. That comes from the Bible. And so their belief in inalienable rights, some of those things they looked at just looking at nature, but then they looked at nature's God. And they said, wow, nature's God gave mankind other inalienable rights, which animals don't understand. And so it's a combination of those two things. One other aspect of this, if you go look at the countries in the world, not every country, not every philosophy of government believes what the founders did. In fact, their view is quite unusual, and it's based on a belief in God creating us and giving us these rights. If you look at communist countries, what's the first thing they always do? They attack religion. And the reason is because they realize that if you accept there being a God, accept religious practice, that means that we have these inalienable rights that cannot be violated. And you can bet the government at many times would like to violate those inalienable rights. And in fact, our own government has violated those inalienable rights numerous times, such as we saw under COVID, right? You had religious exemptions to the vaccine denied. That's a violation of our First Amendment. So, but communist countries first have to destroy belief in God and religious practice, because once you take God out of the equation, there are no inalienable rights to protect. And if you have that situation, then the government can do whatever it feels like with you without limit. But they realize, they have to get rid of God. So, and most communist countries do want to violate your rights, and we see that. So it's important to realize, there's many different views of government, and the founders is fairly unique in the world today. But I think it's the right form of government. It's really based on the Bible. And another thing I'll say about that is people say we have a secular country, and I want to clarify what I believe about that. I actually, in one way, you could say we have a Christian system of government in the sense that the values that we protect, the purpose of government, our inalienable rights, come from a belief in God creating the universe. But I also want to clarify, it doesn't mean you have to be a Christian, obviously, to live in this country or be a citizen. But it does mean the founders looked to the Bible to create this system of government which protects our inalienable rights. To go even a little further on this, in our own country, I talked about communist forms of government in other countries. We can see this battle raging in our own country right now. And I like to say it's a spiritual battle. So there are elements within our country that, we see many in the Democrat Party advocating for these things. They're trying to destroy God. Then they can violate your inalienable rights because you don't have any inalienable rights if you take away God. Just put it that way. And also there's a war on biology. So there's a war on the laws of nature and nature's God, both those things, because you have to get rid of those things. If you can say that men can turn into women or that we have 179 genders, that undermines the basic rights that we're guaranteed. So it's really a war on Western civilization being based upon looking at nature, if you want to call that biology, or looking at the laws of nature, and also looking at nature's God, which is the foundation of our country, to protect our inalienable rights. That is the sole purpose of government. There are many elements in our country warring on those ideas because that will give them free rein then to violate those rights. If you look at communist countries, they always try to erase things, erase religion, erase science, true science, and they also have to erase history. Because a country that is aware of its history and is proud of its history will not accept the communist revolution, which basically tries to destroy all that history and put in place a new kind of utopian system based upon not the power of God, but the power of man. Communism always says we don't need God at all. And I think that worked out pretty terribly if you look at the Bible and the Tower of Babel. That's basically like the first example to me of communism. We're going to do it ourselves. We've got all the knowledge and skill. We don't need God. And God undid the Tower of Babel and scattered those people upon the earth because they were denying the role of God in their government.